Okay, let's get back to the second hour. And what I want to show you now is how to use other attributes from the cout. And I want to show you the advantage of cout over expression. Okay, so let's say our string doesn't have any value. Okay. There is an interesting attribute in cout, which is called default. The way it's used is if you just use autocomplete, there's a default. So you can say, for example, guest. Okay. Let me change this a little bit using, and then we have, so first we have using cout JSTL. Here we have using expression. So with the expression, if your variable is null, you can't really display anything. But the default lets you choose a name in situations where your variable is empty. So this is very useful. If you run this, you will see. Excuse me. So you can see with, well, actually here, they're not displaying anything. Let's go figure out what is happening there. Default, let me get rid of this. Let me run this again. Okay, so now you can see using expression, if there is no value, if the string is null, you can't display anything. But with using JSTL, you can basically have a default value for these kind of situations. What other things you can do with cout? For example, if you want to change the color of what you're displaying, even here, you can use font. Let me complete this. So we say font, we give it a different color, red, let's say red. And then we add guest over here and we close the font tag. Let me close it here. Okay. Now let's run this and we'll see if we can change the color of guest here. So let me display it. Run collections, which in turn is going to call JSP tags.jsp. Okay, something funny happened here, and the reason this happened is that something we forgot to do. We don't want the container to simply display this HTML tags. We want it to interpret it. If you want your HTML tags to be interpreted, there is an extra attribute called escape XML. By default, it's set to true by default. So if you don't change this, it will actually print your HTML tags as they are. However, we want it otherwise. We want it to interpret the HTML tags and then display it. So let's go back and rerun it again. Now you can see that this is taking effect with changing the color of the string, which is guessed. So this was just another simple advantage of using cout over the expression or scriptlet. If you want to define a default value, you have this option here. So let's go back and see what other attributes or what other tags we have, and then we'll go back to Eclipse again. So these are the conversions, the character entity of these codes here. So earlier when escape XML is set to true, which is what it is by default, this is what the container is going to do. Okay, it's going to convert it to these characters, which is what we didn't want to do. So this is basically just describing what I demonstrated with EL and with JSP expression. If the user is null, you're not going to get anything. Whereas with cout JSTL, we have this default attribute, which is very useful. Okay, so we also saw how default works. We don't need to go through that. We also saw how cset works. There are two attributes that we need to set, var and value. So these are the things that we have looked at. Here's what you will see if you go to view source of your browser. That's what you will see if you don't escape XML, if you don't set it to false. The other looping tag, which is also useful, is for tokens. The only difference with for each is, so you probably know what tokens are. If you, let's say, if you have a string, let's say random words, and if your string is separated in some certain way, let's say you're using comma, like word 1, comma, word 2, comma, word 3. You can use for tokens to split them. You can also use for each. However, with for each, you can the compiler understands comma and space. With for tokens, if you use for tokens, if your words are separated by other things such as parentheses, right? You can split them by defining what the delimiter is, DEL. So I'm going to show you in the slides, in a couple of slides, that what you can do with for tokens, how to split strings using tokens. If your variable, the variable you're accessing is a bean, you can use expression language to access the property of it. Or if it's an array, same way you access the items in your array, you can do the same thing using EL. So you can combine your EL with JSTL. And obviously at times it's necessary to combine them, otherwise you can't do what you're trying to achieve. So let's see how to access the properties of a bean and a collection using JSTL. So we add a class, call it person, right? And that person will have certain attributes. So you have two data members, first name and last name, and you have setters and getters. So here's your first getter and the first setter. So this is your person class, which is a bean. That's a bean class. And then we create some objects from your class called person. We have 3 persons added as an array. And then we have 2-dimensional array here. We want to see how we can access them using JSDL, because this is inside a servlet, we're adding it as an attribute to the request object. So we have person array as a first attribute, and then sales as a second attribute to our request object. And obviously, we will have to forward the control, the client, to the JSP page. So this is how we can access the properties of our bean. So remember earlier we used use bean standard action to do this. This is how you can achieve the same using JSTL. So person array, where does this come from? Person array is the name of the attribute, right? We said request dot set attributes, and we gave this name. And then we can say whatever variable we define is the first item. We can say person.firstName, person.lastName. And this is going to print the first names and the last names. We also had an array there. With the array, because it's a 2-dimensional array, we need to use 2 for each, right? It's a nested for each. This is something you can do. Sales is the name of the attribute. Remember, we said request.set attribute sales. And then we have, we defined a name for the sales attribute. And here's how we can print the 2-dimensional array, and a for loop within another for loop. So if we see the result is, because we created a table, we can access both dimensions of an array. So you can do a lot of things using JSDL. Core tags, we haven't even looked at other tags from JSDL yet. But just one more thing to add is this var status. If you add var status to your for each, you will be able to access the index, the current index. You will be able to find out whether it's the first item or it's the last item, beginning and step. So if I go to the next slide, you will see what that means. So let's say we are looping through an array of names, and we have added this attribute, var status. We gave it a name called status, right? And then if I say status last, it will tell you whether it's true or false. So this is going to result in either a true or a false. So if it's true, it means it's the last item. If it's false, it means it's not the last item. Okay. Likewise, if I use index, it will give me an index number. So if I say status.index, then it's not a Boolean, it will be an integer number. Okay. If you don't set this attribute, you will not be able to find out whether it's the last element or the first element, or you can't get the index of the current element. So if you have something, a string like this, comma separated string, you can use for each, no problems. It will split it for you, right? It will split the items for you. You don't need to split it yourself. So what we're doing here is just simply printing the value of country. And you can see here that the commas are not really printed. But with 4 tokens, we can basically split other strings that use different delimiters. So for example, the delimiter here is parentheses. And what we have to do, we have to define what the delimiter is by setting the delims attribute in the 4 tokens. So otherwise, 4 token works the same like for each. Okay, this is just an extra functionality, and you can see the result. It splits the strings into these colors without printing the spaces or parentheses. Okay. There are more core tags. There's conditional tags if you want to use if, else, and so on. So basically, if works this way. This is the syntax for using if. So you need to set an attribute called test, see if test, and then if the test evaluates to true, it will run the content. But if you have more than one condition, because with this one you don't have an else, that is a problem with the if. JSTL, you don't have an else. If you have many conditions, then you will need to use choose. You will need to use C choose. And your conditions, every single condition will be defined with when tag, C colon when, and whatever the condition is, you will have to define it within the test attribute. And finally, if you want to have the final condition doesn't have a test, okay? Because these ones are like else if, right? Remember with else if you have a condition, but this one is similar to else, right? So whatever the condition is, if it's not these ones, it's going to execute otherwise. So here is a simple example. We say if I is greater than 7, we're counting from 1 to 10. When I is greater than 7, it's going to print this, display this. Okay. There is no else. Okay. With the if statement, there is no else. So the last the last 3 numbers, 8, 9, 10, will have this extra string printed. Right, greater than 7, greater than 7, greater than 7. Right. With the choose tag works very much like the switch statement. I think you're familiar with that, with switch statements. It lets you choose between a number of alternatives or options. So with the switch statement, we have case statements. But with choose, we have when instead. With switch, we have default. With see with choose, we will have otherwise. So let's see an example of this one as well. So on the left, we have this choose tag. So here's the first condition, second condition, and then third, fourth, whatever other conditions are actually contained within otherwise. Whereas with switch, we have case, and then finally default. So you can see that how things will be different with JSTL. It might take some time to learn all the syntaxes, but the good thing is that Eclipse supports. So if you write something and you don't remember the syntax, Eclipse helps you out with the autocomplete functionality. Here is another example. Because we have more than one condition, we cannot use if anymore. We will use choose instead. If I is less than 4, it prints small. If I is less than 8, it prints medium. If it's greater than 8 or otherwise, it's going to print large. Okay. So you can see first 3 is small, and then medium, and finally large. This is just to demonstrate the use of choose core tag. So this is about conditional tags. We have looked at general tags. Well, we haven't looked at catch and remove yet, but we have looked at the rest. Also, we haven't looked at URL related tags as well. CSet, we already saw an example. If you want to set a variable, we saw how we set a local variable there, but we can use CSet to set the set a value of a map or a Java bean as well. Okay, then you will need to set the scope. You will see how this works. So this is the full syntax of a set. You have a var, you will have a scope, and then you'll have a value. The scope here is actually optional. Okay, so you can see the var is required, but scope is optional. If you remember what scope is, we have page scope, session scope, we have application scope. It's about accessibility, who can access this variable and for how long. So basically, have a look at this statement here. We say cset variable fido value this one. Okay, so based on the type of this value, the variable fido will be a dog object because we're actually assigning a value of a dog. Therefore, var will be a variable of type dog. Here is cset with the body. You can do the same thing, but rather than, so here we have value if you were not using a body. If you're doing it in a single line, you need to set the value attribute. If you're not using value, you can actually use the body. You can use an closing and starting and an ending tag. Another example, using a property and a target, but with no body. So when you're using target, we're actually setting a bean property. If you're using a setting a bean property, you will use target. Then you have to define what property it is, and obviously the value of the property that you want to set. So here we have a dog name property. We want to set a value for it, and this is going to be our target, and it should not be null. So we must already have a Java bean called pet map. Let's say we set it as an attribute, and now we're setting the value of the property dog name. Doing the same thing with the body, just ignoring that value property there, value attribute. So we learned this. Remove is just kind of the opposite of set. If you want to get rid of a Java bean, an object, or a variable, you will remove it. If you don't set the scope of this tag, it will first look at the page scope, then it will look at request, session, and finally application. Here is an example. You're removing this variable called user status. You're giving the scope, so it only deletes the request scope. But this one, as I said, is optional. So if you use remove, you can see that you can no longer see this variable because it has been removed by this tag. If you are familiar with try and catch, and if you want to use it in JSP, you can use c:catch JSTL. It's very simple. So for example, we added a statement that is definitely going to throw some exception, right? If you divide by 0, Java is going to throw an exception, but because you don't want to display exception message to users, you'll use catch, right? And this will be the output. If you see this, we survive, it means we did survive. There was no error message. There is something else you can do with try and catch, which is you can define a var attribute, and then you will be able to get the message of that exception. Right, so if you use the var attribute, later you can say, okay, I want to display the error message, but I want to display it in my own friendly way. URL related tags. So we have seen before, if we want to add content from another JSP file, we can use, earlier we used include, which is a directive. And we also use the JSP include standard action. We saw what are the differences. One of them adds it before runtime. One of them includes the page dynamically after runtime, during runtime. And there is another third way using JSTL C import. So this is basically not to import a package. Don't mistake it. Don't confuse it with import directive. This is similar to the include standard action or the include directive, not the import directive. So if you want to add a header or a footer or something to your page, something that you did using this statement before or this statement before, now you can do it using JSTL, which works like this. And the good thing about C import is that you can specify a URL, an external URL, right? So this is not even in your project. This horse.html is a resource. It's an external resource. It's placed somewhere else, but you can import it using C import JSTL. So this gives you more functionality, which makes it rather useful as compared to the directive or the include standard action. If you use the var attribute, the content of this URL will be copied here. If you don't use this var attribute, the content will be displayed on the browser. But if you use it, it will be copied inside this variable name. So we talked about this. If you want to send some parameters within your import, you can use cparam. If you want to send some parameter to the other page that it's receiving it, you can do it this way. You're sending this parameter called subtitle. That's the value of this parameter. And then this is the page that you are importing. And within that page, you can actually access this parameter. So you can access the value of this parameter. Okay, something important that I want to demonstrate for you is using SQL with JSTL, which is very important. So let me go to Eclipse and show you how do we use SQL if you want to do certain things with our database and we don't want to use scriptlets. Let's see how we can do it in JSTL. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to start my SQL. This one is not started. I'm going to start it. Let's see what tables we created last time. We might use the same thing. My SQL roots, my JSP 2021. Okay. Show databases. Okay, the one we created last time, I think it was called JSP 2021, so I'm gonna use that one, JSP 2021. Show tables. Okay, we have one table, describe it. Okay, and in this table we have 4 columns: ID, name, owner, birth, and I believe we inserted some values into it. Select, sorry, start from cats. Yeah, we did insert 3 rows into a cat's ID, name, owner, and birth. So let's try to access this table using JSTL. Okay. All right, so I'm going to use the same package, the same project. I will just add another JSP. Let's call it SQL JSTL. Finish this. So the first thing, if you remember when we had JSP, when we were working with the core tags, we added this directive. And likewise, for using SQL, actually, because I'm going to use core tags, so I'm going to add this anyway. But for SQL, the only difference is here you have to change the name to SQL, right? And then obviously you have to give it a different prefix. I prefer to use the conventional one, which is SQL. So it's the title. All right, so let's see how we can do certain things. First of all, we need to know our driver. And what we need to use, again, Eclipse does a good job of auto-completion here. We have to set the data source first and give it a name. But the most important thing here is our driver. If you remember last week, we were looking at doing things with accessing database using servlet. So you can see we have this driver here. Okay, we have a driver here. We used class.forName, and then using driver manager, we got connection. This time it's going to be different. So our driver is com.mysql.jdbc.driver. And in order to get the connections and so forth, we will need to declare a variable. Let's call it db. So here is setting our data source, an opening connection, which happens at the same time. We need to provide the URL. The URL, I can get it from here. It's this one, right? So this one is our URL. I will copy it, and then we need to provide the username and password. Then we will have, if we can use, if you forget it, you can use auto completion. So we need password and user, of course. User is root. Password is, we used it last time. I'm going to copy it from here. JSP 2021. Okay, so this is with opening a connection, not too difficult. Next thing we want to do, we want to execute some queries, and then we want to display it to the user. So what I'm going to do now is SQL, use auto completion. We have query. If you want to write a query, you will use this one. Var, I will set it later, but most importantly is the data source. Data source, our data source is what we already defined here, which is DB, but we have to use expression language in order to access it. DB is an extra, and var is the result of this query will be stored here. So it's important that you give it a proper name. Let's say call it result set, okay, RS. Within the body of query, we will write our SQL query. So we want to get everything from cats, select star from cats. The next thing to do is now to loop through this using for each and display it nicely. Let's display it in a table this time. Let's have a table. We set nice border for it, and we'll also increase the size. So I'm gonna display it in the zoomed in, fits within the browser. So I'm gonna set the width to 100%. What we can do, so we have a table row. Let me close this one. Let's have a table header as well. So the first header, if we go to check the table, the first header is ID, then we have name, owner, and birth. So ID, name, owner. First table holder is cat ID. First table header. Let me copy this. Next one and next one. Then we had a name and the owner. Okay. So this will be our first row. For the second row, because we have 3 rows, I'm going to have to create a for each var, we call it table or cat table, anything. What about items? What do you think is the value for items? What should I say for items? This is something we define here, right? rs, this is going to be this variable using expression language. rs, but rs has a property called rows, which is going to get all the rows that have been selected by using the select statement. rs.rows, there's something wrong. Okay, it has to be within quotation. Still some problem. I don't know what the problem. I don't think there is a problem. I think this, we just need to close it. Yeah. All right, so now let's display the items as a TD, table cell. So what I'm going to say, I'm going to use cout, the value. So the first column is ID, right? So I'm going to say table.id. And use double quotes. Okay. And then we have the second. Is everything all right here? I think it looks okay. The second and then the third, we have table ID. The names have to match, so be careful here. ID, name, and owner. We're not worrying about date, actually. Name and owner. Name. The names must match, so be careful about that. So why is it complaining? Oh, we don't have a table row, right? That's the problem. So let's define a table row and close it here. Still complaining? Well, I think it's fine. I don't see any errors. If you see any errors, let me know. Table ID. We can actually have a try and see if there is any errors, but I doubt it. I think it's all good. rs.rows var table. Okay, let me run it. We'll figure out soon. Okay, there is some problem. JSTL column unterminated. Something is not terminated. Okay, it's probably cout. Let's go and figure out. The cout. Oh, I see. Right, that's the problem. Cout is not terminated. So let's terminate cout. Okay, I think that's fine now. Let's have another try. Oh, okay, owner is not being displayed. Let's see what the problem is there. Oh, sorry, my mistake. Owner, okay. Now it should be fine. Because our table didn't have that name. So, okay, now it's all being printed, all fine. So I think using JSTL with SQL is more fun than a scriptlets, my opinion. But it's up to you. I will tell you how you will need to access database in your assignments for part 2, but As I said before, part 1 doesn't need a database, so you're fine for now. Let me go back to the slides and cover the remaining things. With the URL, if you basically want to, so with URL rewriting, this is a topic that we will learn when we talk about servlets. If you want to basically direct the user and create a session ID for the user, add it to the URL, you will use it, but we haven't studied it now, so I will go through it later when we talk about URL rewriting in Servlet. But once we learn that, it will be easy to do it using JSTL. So for the rest of JSTL, I have just provided the syntaxes, and you can go through them. Very simple. Formatting tags, you will need to add this URI. Again, the only difference is the final words FMT, whereas it was SQL and core in the previous examples. These are the tags that you can use to format a number, to format a date, to format a time zone, for example, if you want to display a time zone nicely to the user. SQL tags, we already looked at some of them. There are actually more. If you want to select something, you will use SQL query. If you want to update something, whether it's update or insert, you will use SQL update. Then I think the rest of them may not be very useful for you, but I have provided the descriptions. In case you want to use them, you can do so for your assignment or for your own sake. Finally, if you want to manipulate XML files, there is JSTL tags available for XML. These are the tags you can do for each with XML documents, or choose when otherwise, just like you did with your core tag. So if you're using XML tags, you can use JSTL along with it. Finally, JSTL functions, which is the last category we talked about, JSTL functions. There are some extra functions available for you. I think if you have done C programming, you have seen some of these functions. This one tests if an input string contains a substring. Okay, so for example, if you want to see whether your sentence have a word in it, okay, you will use this function, mainly for text processing. If you want to see if your string ends with a certain substring with a certain text, you can use this one. There are plenty of functions available for you if you want to, especially if you're doing some text processing. If you're processing text with your JSP, you can utilize JSTL functions. So this brings us to the end of today's class. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'm always available on QQ. I'm always available on QQ. If you have any questions regarding your assignments, feel free to ask. Again, I'm available on QQ. So thank you all for coming, and see you soon. Okay, so Goodbye, everyone. See you soon.